What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to my channel. So today we've got some pretty exciting stuff. Maintenance on the Subaru. Going to be throwing a timing belt kit on the EJ207 along with a new water pump. So, like I said, we're going to be throwing this timing belt kit onto the EJ207, and I should have done it a long time ago, because even though that this engine has around 85,000 kilometers on it, which is right around like 60,000 miles, it is almost 20 years old. So a 20-year-old timing belt definitely is due for a change, even if it hasn't reached its mileage for what Subaru recommends you change it. So boxer engines really aren't that hard to change the timing belts on. A lot of people make them sound a lot worse than they really are, but they're really not that bad. They are kind of tucked in there, and at most you might have to remove the two bottom motor mounts and jack up the engine a little bit to get a little bit more access. But I found just either removing the radiator, which you might as well do that because you get so much more room, and you got to drain the coolant anyway to replace the water pump, so you might as well just pull the radiator and get that out of the way. And once you do that, usually you have way more than enough room to actually get everything off. So I'm going to start by pulling the radiator, and to do that I only have the one bracket, you'll have the two, and then the bottom and the top radiator hose, as well as like the overflow fittings and whatnot. Make sure you put something underneath, like a bucket or whatnot, because you're about to dump like 1.5 gallons of coolant everywhere, so definitely make sure you do that. Alright, next thing, gonna loosen up the accessory belt, that way get that off, free the crank pulley, and then crack the crank pulley loose. Alright, next step, we're going to be removing the crank pulley, and to do that you need a 22mm and a really long breaker bar. Best way to hold back the crank is to just put it in gear, e-brake on, unless you want to buy the special Subaru tool that actually locks into the crank pulley. Definitely do that because it'll hold it back. Alright, so next step after you get the crank pulley off, remove the timing belt cover, and you need a 10mm to do that. So once you get all the timing belt covers off and everything, remove the timing belt guide, and that's just two 10mm bolts. And then we'll reinsert our actual crank bolt and rotate the engine over to line up all the timing marks before we actually remove the belt. That way it's easier to actually put the new belt on once all the marks are already there. So the notches that you're looking for to line up in this are the two that are on the actual crank sprocket and the one that's on the oil pump near the top. Here's what you want on both of the intake cams. So there's a line at the top, as you can see, and you want to line it up with the timing cover. And then near the bottom, you'll see that there's two double lines that need to line up with each other, and a side line that's hard to see that needs to line up with the timing belt cover as well. Next step, crack loose all of the idler pulleys and remove them. Alright, next thing we're going to remove is the water pump, which is 6 10mm bolts, and I would remove the thermostat housing first, but you don't have to. That's just two 10mm bolts on the front half of it. Alright, now that we got the water pump off, I'm going to clean the mating surface on the block where the water pump will actually go. That way the gasket will get a good seal. Then once you get them snuggled up, torque them to 9 foot-pounds in a crisscross pattern. So next step, throw the 2 heater core hoses on the right and the other coolant line going to the oil cooler on the left side. All right, next thing, after you get your water pump torqued down, you're gonna wanna install your new thermostat, and so throw your new gasket on there, and then make sure when you actually install it that the little bleeder hole is at the top of the engine. That way air can actually pass through it. So the next thing you wanna do is install the idler pulleys and the tensioner, which before you install the tensioner, if you get one of the Gates kits, which they just started including this paper, is like how to bleed the actual piston in here. I've heard of them failing before and not actually like holding tension on the belt and causing the belt to slip, so this must be a new thing that they're figuring out that was causing the issue. So they say just throw it in a vise or some sort of like C-clamp, so you can actually depress the piston 3 or 4 times and then put the pin back in. So that's what I'm going to do in my vise really quick, and then throw it in. So in the paper it says that the reason you do that is try to get any air out of the actual cylinder, since when it's on the actual car it's not going to like fully depress and then come all the way out to be able to get any of that trapped air out. Alright, now you can begin installing the idlers. Start with the tensioner. You just want to get these hand tight initially until you actually get the belt in there, and then you can actually torque it up. Okay, so once you get all those idler pulleys on, you just want to leave those 2 off. That way you can add them later. Once you actually get the timing belt in the right spot, you can begin setting your pulleys into the correct timing positions. So the right side of the engine is easy because there's no tension on it, so they freely move. And then the left side of the engine is actually a little bit more difficult because there is tension on the actual valves. So to do that, you need a 10mm Allen head, and just rotate it clockwise until you line up the marks. If you do have ABCS on this, so if you have a newer EJ207 or a 255, 257, whatever, you will have to remove your ABCS covers, which is just 3, I think 10mm bolts to get out the actual Allen head, but it'll rotate the same once you take that off. All right, once you line up all the timing marks, you're ready to throw the belt on. Make sure when you throw the belt on, you can read the writing that's on it, because if you can't, the solid marks won't line up with the actual cam timing marks. The dotted line is for the crank, and the solid ones are for the cams. But once you get everything lined up, you're good to throw it on. Once you get all the timing marks lined up and you double check it and make sure it's all good, you're good to throw on the last 2 tensioners. So throw on the big one first in that lower left corner, and then the little one goes right here to put a little bit more tension on there. And then you could pull the pin on the actual tensioner and then rotate it a few times. Make sure all your timing marks still are lined up, nothing moved weird, and that everything's good. You definitely don't want to just think it's good on the first go and you might be off by a tooth or something like that. Have to rip into this thing again, or be off by a lot more and actually cause a lot of damage to the engine. So definitely not worth it. Rotate the engine over a few times by hand before you actually go to start it and bolt everything back up. now I've got to torque all the idler pulleys and the tensioner and the small idler. To do that, the larger ones require 29 foot-pounds as per the FSM, and the smaller one is 18. So double check your FSM for your specific engine. I definitely want to over torque it, but most Subarus are all the same, with 29 for the larger ones and 18 for the smaller one. And double check your timing marks before you start rotating it, just to make it easier in case you see any of them off. Alright, so here's what actual correct timing marks look like. So you got the line on the belt lined up with the little notch on the pulley, which is right here, lined up with the little notch in the timing belt cover. And if you look below, you'll see that there are, let this thing focus, 2 double timing marks that line up with each other right here. And then there's another one over here, which is hard to see. It's easier if you get a mirror or you use your cell phone or something like that to make sure it's lined up. But there's another line on the belt that looks just like that. And then the crank, dotted line with the mark in the actual pulley, lines up with the little notch in the actual oil pump. And same thing over here. All 3 line up, make sure it's all good, and then rotate a couple times by hand before you actually throw it all back together. Alright, so once you actually verify that your timing marks are still good after you rotate it a couple times by hand, you're good to throw the timing belt guide back on, and Gates actually throws in like a little spacer to make sure that you actually put it in the right spot. Since if it's too tight to the actual belt, it'll cause a lot of friction and you could prematurely destroy your belt and end up with some bent valves. Are you good to throw on the timing belt cover? Next, got to torque the crank pulley bolt, and depending on the model, for EJ207s they have a different bolt, so it's like 132.8 foot-pounds is what the FSM calls for on that. Some WRXs and STIs and stuff in the US with their EJ257s and 255s and whatnot, they call for 90 foot-pounds I believe, but just check your FSM for your year and get your torque specs for that, but I'm doing 132. Next up, accessory belt. The next step, throw the radiator back in here. But now that I got coolant in, it's ready to attempt to start up, and always be ready, just in case, to shut it off right away, because you never know, you could have missed the timing marks or something like that, and if you shut it off in time, you might save your valves, or at least limit the amount of damage you do. But that's why you triple, double check, whatever, so you don't actually have that problem. So, but always be wary and be ready to shut it off. Alright, and she lives, so just gotta let the coolant cycle, get all the air out of the system and whatnot, turn the heat on, and crack one of those valves, make sure that all the air is actually out of the system. That way you don't run into any cooling issues from like an air pocket getting stuck in the thermostat, which is also why you want to put that bleeder screw at the top of the thermostat, because if you get a little air pocket, it's going to go to the top and it can't escape past the thermostat. So definitely can cause cooling issues, and if you do one of these, if you're good to do that and you have any cooling issues, definitely go check your thermostat. Alright, so let the car get up to temperature for like 15 or so minutes, fan cycled a couple times, made sure all the air was out and whatnot, but I will actually take it for a drive and let it like cycle a few times and see how it does in the heat to make sure that there's no air in there before I actually like take it on a long drive or anything like that. But Subaru's cooling systems are really good about it. If you ever get any air in the system, that they'll get rid of it itself, especially on the turbo models where they have the coolant reservoir up here. They're really efficient as long as you do that the thermostat where the bleed port is at the top. Definitely make sure you do that. Hopefully the video is pretty clear on what you actually have to do to get the timing belt done. It is very easy if you just download the FSM for your particular car and you just follow it step by step. And if you've got a single overhead cam engine, it's even easier because then you don't even have to align that second cam on both sides. Yeah, that's all I've got for this one. I appreciate you guys watching my videos. Let me know on any feedback. If you have any questions about the timing belt, maybe I didn't show or something like that that you want me to address, definitely let me know or give it a Google, whatever you want to do. But appreciate it. Thanks.